No. I think Brett has the link. I'm pretty sure he accepted the invite, so you should have the link. I don't see anyone else. Okay, well, it is 1 o'clock. So I'm wondering if someone else. So that might be Demita or Brett. I'm not sure who's just joined. Awesome. Okay. Brett, wonderful. Wonderful. Welcome, Brett.
Hello.
Hi.
Good to
All
see you
right.
all.
Well, good to see you as well. I'm thankful that y'all are all here. Damien is unable to join us. He had a last minute meeting pop up, so he sends his apologies. And we have one more person that'll be joining, and so she'll probably pop on later. So she actually works while she's doing this, and so she may not be able to jump on just yet. But we can go ahead and get started. Ashley, are we rolling? Are we good to go?
Good to go.
All right. So welcome everyone to our November community conversation. This month we are discussing sentencing reform and Oklahoma's outdated criminal code. Our criminal code has been a major contributor to mass incarceration in our state and desperately needs to be modernized. I'm going to let our panel tell us more about that today. And we only have 1 hour, so I'm going to jump right into it and introduce them to you. We are privileged to have Brett Tolman, the executive director for Right on Crime and former U.S. attorney. Joining him is Marilyn Davison, the Oklahoma State Director for Right on Crime. We also have our policy counsel, Michael Olson, and will be joining us is Demita Price, who's an OCJR ambassador and criminal legal reform advocate. And then I'm your moderator, I'm Evita Fox-Kreider. And so thank you all for being here, really appreciate it. And I'm just going to jump right in with our first question. And Brett, this will go to you. Tell us, for people that maybe don't know the lingo that we use or the language, what is felony classification? Like, what does that mean?
Well, it's amazing to have conversations with folks that aren't steeped in criminal law, right? That don't spend 25 plus years in it like I have, and I forget sometimes that every word is unique and it has its own language. And the criminal justice system is really divided into 3 categories broadly. You have infractions, which are sort of your speeding tickets and parking tickets, things of that nature that are in the criminal code, but not really, something that makes an individual feel like they're a criminal, although we do hate getting pulled over. You then have misdemeanors, which is anything that's punishable in jail or prison for less than a year, just generally speaking. And then a felony is one where obviously the penalty can be much higher, and from short sentences all the way to life in prison, or even the death penalty where applicable. Felony classification is really, and Oklahoma should not feel bad. They are not alone in this. So many states spend very little time in their criminal statutes and updating them and making sure that they aren't, criminalizing things that are no longer criminal, or that they're too severely criminalizing things and issues that shouldn't be the case. We can cite a ton of examples, but in essence, what Oklahoma is doing, and I applaud that, is they're saying, okay, this is overdue. We're going to look at all of our felonies. We're going to try to get rid of ones that we don't need. We're going to assess whether or not the sentences are appropriate. And frankly, I wish every state in the union and the federal system would do that.
Thank you for that. And Marilyn, just to follow up, so we know our classification is a bit problematic. Like, what led to it, and maybe an example would help for viewers.
Well, every year I feel like we add another felony to the list in statutes. We hear all the time the statistic that we're the second largest incarcerator in the United States. Some people say the third. I think we kind of go back and forth from week to week. Part of the contributing factor to us having the highest population in the United States is that for some of our crimes, we convict people at a higher rate than the other states that border us. So, for example, property offenses in Oklahoma, you receive a 70% longer term than what the national average is. And so for drug offenses, that's 79%. So that's really created a problem in that we've kind of bloated our felony sentencing. I like to always say that we like to legislate based on our emotions, and that we get mad and something happens. And so we go in and we like to, change our statute to increase that penalty or make it a felony. And that's just not been the best way for us to legislate. And it's not improved our public safety, and it's done nothing but grow our prison population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you gave the distinction like property crimes and other, those are okay.
Yeah.
Are we seeing, like, Mike, are we seeing any differences in or inequities along gender lines in terms of sentencing at all? Mike or Marilyn, or anyone else about that?
Yeah, I mean, at least one very high profile example is failure to protect cases where women get longer sentences than the men who physically committed the abuse. And these aren't only just disparities between men and women, but actually between the individual women themselves. And there's not really any clear reason for it. I guess the average sentence length for failure to protect cases is around 11 years in prison and probation. But the lowest one recorded was 2 years of probation, and the highest was life in prison. So you can see that's just a huge, huge range. And it just reinforces the idea that there's a need for standardization. Gender, race, economic status, and geography shouldn't be the reason that a sentence is changed. So if our goal is a fair and just system, that shouldn't be the case. But I'm sure there are cases also where men get much higher sentences than women. It just shows how this system of sentencing doesn't really make sense and how it can be standardized.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just for the audience, for people who may not know, failure to protect, what exactly is that? What does that mean?
There's specific cases where a person's partner commits child abuse or something of that nature, and then the woman is charged as well for permitting it to happen or allowing it or not protecting the child.
Okay, thank you. So you all mentioned our neighboring states. Like, what are our neighboring states doing? And are there examples that we can, learn lessons from, and how do we fare compared to them? This is Brad or anyone actually who wants to answer this.
Yeah, I think we probably all have some insight on this, but right on crime, one of the reasons we're so passionate about, trying to create that fair and just criminal justice system is that it's one of the areas where very little transparency and accountability has ever really applied. We've just kind of let the criminal justice system grow without much, supervision, so to speak. it's in every state. There are particular issues. You look at Mississippi, for example, and Mississippi is battling Oklahoma for the highest rate of incarceration. And one of the problems that they have is that, they had very little ability to utilize effectively parole. They had narrowed over the years so badly who could be eligible for parole that in essence, they didn't have a parole program. So one of the efforts that we led was to try to expand those that might be eligible for parole. So there's various ways that you can sort of tackle the issue. There's not one size fits all to do it. But we want to emphasize that the states need to do it. And one of the reasons is, for example, in Mississippi, DOJ acknowledged that, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to investigate you because now your incarceration rate is so high. We think that it's presented civil rights violations against those that are being incarcerated. Well, that means it went too far. The state should have been working on this well in advance. And every state that's getting very high on that incarceration rate is not necessarily the states that have the most crime. Sometimes those policies can just be really that bad. I'll let Marilyn and Mike give you some of their insight.
Well, I think if we look at a state that could be a warning to Oklahoma, if we look at Florida, they a few years ago enacted mandatory minimums for all of their crimes. And that had a lot of unintended consequences in their state. And it really hinders a judge's ability to look at an individual and look at their individual situation and try to find maybe a different way to punish them with alternative sentencing and those sort of things. And by looking at their history and also their risk of offending. And so now, when you look at sentencing guidelines in Florida now, those low-level drug offenders are being subject to the same sentencing guidelines as more of the major drug dealers that are actually causing the problem. And they've had a hard time going back and fixing that since they passed it. So I think that's a good cautionary tale for Oklahoma to look at when we're moving forward with amending our sentencing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Greg.
In the opposite direction, a model to look at, as Marilyn mentioned earlier, is Kansas. Kansas is such a natural comparison because they're demographically and politically similar to Oklahoma, but they have a felony classification system, and we can see at their medium sentence length that Kansas and Oklahoma are similar in violent crime and drug crimes, but in property crimes, Oklahoma has nearly double the median length of stay at 22 months compared to 11 months. So that right there is a big reason for the disparity in the incarceration rate, is just how much longer Oklahoma sentences property crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me just add, because I think it's probably the right time to do so, that why we're in this sort of problem has a lot to do with what Marilyn said. Legislators start to try to one up each other, and you have a high profile case, or you have something that emotionally charges a legislature, and they decide they want to get tough on crime, and their only idea on getting tough on crime historically has been to pass more criminal laws and to lengthen criminal sentences. And it's both sides, Republicans, Democrats, that have done it. And really the National Congress has been the one leading it. And I like to tell people that the federal system does very little well, and it's really bad at criminal justice. And yet all the states have been following, getting this determinant sentencing, expanding the use of mandatory minimums. And what we now see is that has failed us as a nation in terms of wanting to do what the very, very, sort of objective of passing those laws has been, which is to reduce crime. In fact, it doesn't reduce crime. All you've done is taken one criminal and you've expanded the length of time and the length of sentence. I had one case in which I knew the kid was not a bad kid. He had a bad weekend. He didn't kill anybody. He made some mistakes, but because of these mandatory minimum sentences, he was looking at 75 years mandatory minimum. He had very little criminal history, a 23-year-old. And I had to go to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. to get permission to offer him 35 years.
Wow.
Which he took, and he pled to it. And so what has happened is Oklahoma, Mississippi, many of these states, Florida, believe it or not, Idaho has the highest rate of incarceration per capita in this country. And why are all these states having these issues? Because they decided to follow that federal model that has occurred over the last several decades. Well, now data and research is showing that was absolutely wrong. And so we want to show that to these legislators so they start to take a different approach, because being tough on crime means you actually reduce crime and you reduce recidivism. And we should be lessening the number of people we put into our prisons if we're reducing crime.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That just makes me wonder if we are seeing a rollback nationally in terms of this model. Are we seeing that at all? Are we seeing states kind of like wake up and say, okay, this is not good for us, and we're seeing a tidal wave move in the opposite direction?
Yeah, I'll give just real quick and then let Marilyn and Mike, but you have two very, very big factors. You have this rise in violent crime that is occurring. And then at the same time, you have a bunch of so-called enlightened prosecutors who decided that they were going to effectively administer what their brand or their version of criminal justice reform was. And some of those policies were not well thought out. You take the bail decisions in Houston or the bail efforts in New York. I get why they wanted to implement bail reform, and we push for meaningful bail reform because we don't want individuals sitting in our jails because they can't afford some small amount of bail.
Right.
But what they did is they went too far, and they didn't consider that a lot of the individuals need to be looked at who might be a risk of danger to your community. And if that's the case, then you have to have a mechanism to hold those that are actually dangerous. And so there is meaningful reform that can be done, but those two things, Avita, they are, prosecutors that made some bad decisions, and then the rise in violent crime, and now you have a citizenry that's concerned, they're afraid, and that's going to drive policy that's kind of rolling back, like you say, that's policy that's going to be bad. And so we have to jump in now with a lot of energy, and it is more important that we are vocal now so that they see that if you go back to some of those old policies, you're not going to fix this problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. I really want to focus on just for a moment, because a lot of people think, okay, this does not affect me. I've never been incarcerated. I don't know anybody incarcerated, but like, how does it impact the individual who may be sentenced for an excessively long sentence because, of how we do our policies, our sentencing laws. And then how does it also affect the public interest?
I think if you look at just the economic impact of the criminal justice system in Oklahoma, we spend $500 million a year on our corrections system. And I think if we really drill down to look at the people that are in it and how many need to be there versus how many could be better served out in the community, and doing some sort of rehabilitation program, some education programs, I think that should concern Oklahomans, especially when we look at other parts of our state government that could use additional funding. And there are funds there at corrections that could be better spent. I think also you have to consider too, when we talk about public safety, is when we send someone to prison on a sentence that's a lot longer than is appropriate for their crime. You hear it a lot that, we're probably just creating better criminals than we are better Oklahomans. And what I would always say to people, when we release someone from prison, they're going to be standing in line next to you at Walmart buying your groceries or at the gas station. They also have children that they're going home to. And so we should really be focusing on making sure that we are rehabilitating them, that we are correcting them, which is what the Department of Corrections was originally created for, and that we are preparing them to be good law-abiding citizens. And we're not doing a good job of that right now in Oklahoma because we don't have the resources. And the resources we do have are strained because we have too many people in prison when there were more appropriate ways to handle them.
Mm-hmm. Mike, did you
Yeah,
have
to
anything?
me, it has a couple of effects. As Marilyn mentioned, there's the whole tax situation, how much money we're spending on incarceration, but it breaks up families. It takes mothers and fathers away from their children. Children of incarcerated mothers are around 70% more likely to experience an adverse childhood experience, also known as ACEs. And those include things like seeing domestic violence or living with someone that has a mental illness or a substance abuse disorder. And those individuals who have a large amount of ACEs during their own childhood are more likely to go to prison. So nearly 60% of the female prisoners in Oklahoma reported experiencing 4 or more ACEs during their childhood. And when you compare that to the general population, that is 8.5%. So you can see there's a huge disparity there. And this is creating a cycle where incarcerated mothers create incarcerated children through not being there and having these adverse childhood experiences subjected on their children. And not only that, but it costs a lot of money to the family to have a loved one incarcerated. 33% of families go into debt, and they lose an average of almost $28,000 because a loved one is incarcerated. And that is removing money from local rural economies. As you can imagine, a loss of that amount of buying power won't necessarily affect the economies of Tulsa or Oklahoma City, but it can have a catastrophic effect for rural economies.
Mm-hmm. So it's like further destabilizing a family and maybe even generations. So Marilyn, you mentioned before that, Florida had the mandatory minimums and judges' hands were tied. Well, what about in Oklahoma? What role do our judges and our prosecutors play in this? And this is Mike, Marilyn, anyone who wants to answer, like how can they maybe counteract, or, maybe are they contributing? Go ahead.
Yeah, we have a lot of district attorneys and judges that do a very good job at looking at alternative sentencing programs that they could utilize. Unfortunately, that's not very standardized across our state, which could be better. So I think that education is a very good thing for those judges and prosecutors, and they could play a bigger role in kind of diverting more people from prison. The problem that we have in Oklahoma is the data on just the people being sent to prison, why they're being sent to prison, what works, what doesn't work. And I know that we're working on getting better data regarding that. And also, we don't do assessments pre-sentencing for everyone in determining who is going to be a true risk to society and who is better served in the community. And I think that's a tool that could be better used. But we do see a big disparity across the state in sentencing. I always say, when you look at people that are in DOC and you start reviewing their case files, you can find 2 people with the very same criminal background history, exact same crime, and one person got 20 years and one person got 5. And the only difference was the county that they were sentenced in. And, the Oklahoma Policy Council did some research and some data independently on that back in 2017. And they found that counties in the southwestern part of the state sent people to prison at higher rates than the northeastern part of the state. Now, could it be crime rates? Could it be their people? Could it be their resources? We really don't know. But we do know that when we look at the 2 largest counties in Oklahoma, which are Oklahoma County and Tulsa County, which do have a lot of resources, when we take all 77 counties and rank them by the number of people they're sending to prison, Oklahoma County and Tulsa County are number 50 and number 58. So they're doing something right there. It's just, like I said, getting that data to figure out, what's working, what's not working, and making sure that we're making policy decisions based on data and based on science and not based on emotions and campaign promises.
You mentioned, sorry, Mike, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I just want to say that judges and prosecutors are really put in a very difficult situation with this because when you look at the political pressures on them, really generally the only negative public response is when something bad happens, like they give out a short sentence and that person comes out and commits a heinous crime. And those situations are statistically rare, but they have a huge impact on the minds of voters. So judges and prosecutors are in a place where we're asking them to balance job security versus public safety. And it's just a tough situation for them.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I don't know how we can rectify that. Maybe y'all have some ideas. I am curious about when you talk about the science of it. So these pre-assessment or risk assessment, that they do for folks that you're saying that we should do. Like, what would that look like? What kind of factors would they, consider to say somebody, is a danger or somebody, is not?
Yeah, Brett might be a little bit more qualified to speak on it, but I do know it's an assessment that they do inside the county jail, and it supposedly takes 2 to 3 minutes. And I know that it does look at their criminal background. It does look at the facts of the crime. It does look at factors like, do they have a job? It looks at their poverty, I believe, but it takes some of those things that have been proven to determine someone's likelihood of reoffending. And it has basically a scoring scale that they use. And then based on that, it can determine the appropriate way to handle that person.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, that risk assessments have been historically criticized because they were very static and they were just very limited factors. Now, with the work of a lot of folks in this area, including Ed Latessa, who recently passed away, but he devoted his life to developing a dynamic risk assessment, which really would include expansion of the assessment to their families, their communities, a lot of different factors besides just that, that one factor, which might be how many times they've been arrested, or all the run-ins with the law, and that was an inadequate indicator. So hopefully we move towards those dynamic risk assessments so that we can be fair in assessing someone, because sometimes they can have a criminal history and they're actually very trustworthy to be out into the community, but because of different factors, you wouldn't know that.
Yeah. And I will add to that. One of the problems that we've had previously as a justice system is asking the question, why? We get a lot of people in our Department of Corrections who have been arrested several times, sentenced several times, and people ask, why are they doing this crime over and over? There's that automatically assumption that, well, they're a bad person. And we haven't really stopped and looked back at, have they ever been offered an alternative sentencing program? Have they ever been offered counseling, drug counseling? We had an individual, a female at Mabel Bassett, who was in for several theft charges. And because of our enhancement laws in Oklahoma, ended up getting a life sentence for that. But no one stopped to really look at her and see that she had some substance abuse issues in her life. And it took, 8 or 9 times of her being arrested and sentenced before anyone ever stopped and said, maybe we should give her some treatment.
Right, which is what? It's cheaper than
it is cheaper than prison. And we wonder, like, that's just, that's a given, that's a duh. But we do have some counties that's not as easy. I do remember seeing one individual at the Department of Corrections who was sent to us, and we didn't feel it was appropriate for them to be in Department of Corrections. And they said on the sentencing document that there is a better place for him to be, but we don't have the resources in our county, so I'm sending him to DOC. Wow. And that was just very eye-opening, and knowing that, some people get stuck in the system just because there's no other alternative in their part of the state.
Wow. That's why we need those 781 funds, right? I do get, so my next question, and I hear this often or get questions about it, is about the violent crimes, right? And so each year we're seeing the list, increase of what's considered a violent crime. And And so there's a lot of, I don't know, fog around it, or, people don't know, a lot of questions around what makes something violent versus something, another offense. Can you speak to, or anyone, Mike, Marilyn, Brett, can you speak to the criteria that's used to determine whether an offense is actually violent or not? And are there policies that are proven to reduce violent crime? That's my follow-up question for that.
I want to start on this one. So when I did government relations for the Department of Corrections, and this was probably 5 years ago, we went to the legislature and said, look, in Oklahoma statute, we have several places where it lists something as a violent crime. So it'll say, this is a felony with, 0 to 20-year sentence and will be considered violent. And it wasn't very uniform. And then we also had a section in statute that listed a few violent crimes, but didn't include all the crimes that are listed in statute individually. So we went, and another problem too was what the district attorneys were using as violent crime in regards to sentencing was a different list that DOC was using in regards to violent crimes when it came to parole. So we went to the legislature and said, look, we've got to have a consistent list that we know every group is using. So we had staff dig through all of the statute, pull out everything listed as a violent crime, and put all of those under Title 57, Section 571. It seemed like a really small thing, but it was extremely helpful in making sure we are being consistent in how we manage those. We did not advocate to say what we wanted on the list, what we didn't want on the list. We said it's already there and go from there. But I do think when the lawmakers are looking at making something a violent crime or addressing the sentence for something, that they typically want to add that violent crime title to it to ensure that their sentences are more strict, and also to ensure that they are handled as a violent criminal whenever you're looking at parole and certain sort of programs inside Department of Corrections.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
The FBI defines violent crime as those offenses that involve force or the threat of force. And in their uniform crime reporting database, they use 4 offenses to create the violent crime rate, and that is murder and other non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And I believe the list that Marilyn was talking about has around 53 crimes that it calls violent. So you can see that the definition is pretty vague and amorphous, and what violent crime really means is undetermined. But as far as stopping violent crime, there are a couple things that the criminology literature finds that statistically raises the violent crime rate, and that includes the percent below the poverty line and higher income inequality. So any policy that attacks those areas would statistically lower the crime rate. And that's part of the problem with our sentencing structure currently, is that these long sentences are making the financial situation of our already lowest earners even worse, which is in turn raising the violent crime rate and making us less safe. In the most recent FBI quarterly report, Tulsa ranked 12th out of 152 cities with a population over 100,000 for most violent crimes, and Oklahoma City ranked 50th. So we can see that these sentencing practices, just something's not working, because Oklahoma is less safe than other states and has longer sentences.
All right, go ahead. Was someone want to say something? Okay. I'm going to move on then to the next question. Mike, you mentioned in the beginning how the criminal code, how a modernized one could help with biases, right? Like how we see racial disparities at virtually every stage of our criminal legal system. How could it help alleviate any implicit biases in the sentencing process?
Yeah, by just standardizing the range that can be applied. So I think as an example, I can roll in some specific examples. Larceny of an automobile right now has a range of 3 to 10 years, and it could be lowered to say like 0 to 7, or even worse, crime like burglary has a range for the second offense has a range of 2 years to life. So you can see that is such like about as wide as possible a range as you can have. So if that was lowered to say like 0 to 8 years, that alone would ensure that these implicit biases aren't allowing judges and prosecutors to allow those biases to over sentence people based on things that should not be considered when sentencing.
Mhm.
There's a
go
lot
ahead.
of there's a lot of history on the sort of, I agree with Mike wholeheartedly on narrowing those ranges can also lead to greater consistency among your judges. But a lot of people I talk to will say, well, the criminal justice system, it applies to everyone the same, and don't commit the crime if you don't want to do the time. And I have to point out to them, well, that's basically what our public believes, a lot of them, and until you have a conversation with them. And I'll point out to them things like, well, did you know that currently in the federal system, for example, you can sentence an individual 100 times longer for the same exact drug based on the drug and not based on the person. And there's like, what do you mean? I said, well, for years, Congress was really scared of inner cities and crack cocaine, and they were very, very scared of the crime that was coming as a result of crack cocaine. And so they decided that they would ramp up the sentences that were applying to crack cocaine to 100 times longer than those that would do the same offense with powder cocaine. Well, what that did was result in just incarcerating at 100 times longer those in the inner cities where crack cocaine was being used, and races, African Americans and some of the Mexican and Hispanic communities were ravaged by crack cocaine, and they were getting far longer sentences than those who would typically use powder cocaine, which would be in your Caucasian suburban neighborhoods. That's an example of how fear drove that policy, emotion drove the policy, and it had a racial disparate impact, and it needed to be fixed. We did fix that. We were able to rein it in. Now the difference is only 18% long, or 18% longer than the on crack and powder, but it still needs to be fixed. We still need to get it back down to 1-on-1, so the disparity is not 18 times longer for crack cocaine than it is to powder. And those examples exist in every state. Oklahoma has, they have statutes on the books that are disparately impacting. You might not set it out to do it, but if you don't understand it and you don't analyze it, you'll never be able to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that we've been doing too, in looking at our classification of felony crimes, number one, we want to make sure that we set those different classes of crimes. So in Oklahoma, you don't have, the class A, B, C crimes, which other states do. That makes things a lot easier. And knowing that we're going to put this under a class A, so we know that this is the type of punishments, or we're going to push under a class C. And it makes judges easier. It's easier for judges to know with sentencing. It's also easier for defendants to kind of understand where they're going to be. We're all over the place right now in Oklahoma. If you are convicted for giving a controlled substance to a minor on your first offense, your max sentence is 5 years in prison. But if you provide false information on an application, your max sentence is 20 years. And to me, those just don't add up. And I could find 100 examples like that in our statute. And it's not because Oklahoma thinks that one thing is worse than the other. The problem is that we micro-focused on a certain crime at one period in time. And at that time, we placed what we thought was an appropriate sentence based on whatever factors were happening, and didn't really look at the whole picture and look at how we were going to really prioritize what crimes are more appropriate for these longer sentence terms versus what needed to be on the lower end.
Okay. And we think, modernizing it or restructuring will help even county to county, right? And so that there's not this disparity between how counties implement justice. Is that the belief as well?
One of the things that we've been advocating for is really narrowing those ranges instead of making like we have some that are like 5 years to life, which is a huge range, is narrowing down what those ranges are. And then we've also been advocating not as right on crime, not to really get rid of enhancements, but to look at what's appropriate when there's an appropriate situation to use an enhancement, and then what situations we're using them for that's not appropriate. And also kind of reining in those enhancements too, because that's how you get the female that was in Mabel Bassett who stole 2 purses and got a life sentence. Because you get a judge, we called them inside prison, we'd call them the "we're tired of you" sentences. You get a judge that gets tired of seeing that person in their courtroom. They're limited, their hands are tied on what they can do. And so they give them the absolute max that they can possibly give them in statute so that they don't have to deal with them anymore. And that does not serve the public as far as public safety. It doesn't serve that individual. It doesn't serve taxpayers. And so kind of looking at how we can rein those stories in. Now, that's a very rare story, but it is a good example of what we've done in setting our system up the way it is.
Mm-hmm. Has there ever been an attempt to reorganize our criminal code? And if so, like, apparently it was unsuccessful, but has there ever been a real attempt to do that?
Not since I've been at the Capitol, but I've heard there was in the 90s. Someone might have a better answer for that. I think Damien has the history on that, so that's why I wish he was here, but not since I've been at the Capitol.
Right. Okay. Well, then I'll move to our next question, and I think we're almost there. But what will you all, so this is for everyone or anyone that would like to respond, but what would your response be to an opponent of, changing up our classification system?
Well, I guess I would say that there's basically 3 ways that prisons have been promised as an idea to keep the public safe, and those are deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. And our current sentencing structure is focusing almost exclusively on incapacitation, which means that individuals cannot endanger the public at that point because they're actively in prison. And that's the main effect that these long sentences are having, because we know that long sentences don't deter criminal offenders. The literature shows that what's more important to criminal offenders is the certainty of punishment rather than the severity, meaning that when they're thinking about doing a criminal act, they're worried about, will I get caught, not how long will my punishment be. And it also is hard to be rehabilitated when you're in for prison for that long. Like Marilyn talked about, or Brett talked about, that person who got 35 years. If you're in prison for 35 years, what is really your incentive to rehabilitate yourself if you're just going to be sitting in prison that entire time? So why even try at that point? That just shows why these long sentences aren't affecting public safety. And the whole goal of a criminal legal system is to make the public more safe. So if it's not working to do that, then why are we doing it?
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. And I always tell people, don't confuse incarcerating someone with increasing public safety. That there are people who need to be incarcerated. There are very dangerous criminals out there that prison is the best and probably only place for them. And so I'm not one of you'll never hear Right on Crime advocating to abolish the prison system, because we understand its place in society and in protecting the public. However, we do need to change our mindset in that incarceration is not always the answer when someone commits a crime. That we need to invest in our police. We need to invest in evidence-based programming. We need to invest in alternatives to incarceration. And by doing that, we'll start to see a reduction in our crime, in our recidivism, and we'll also decrease the amount of taxpayer dollars we're having to put towards our corrections system. But making those changes, it's not always easy because it's asking people to change their mindset of how they've always been taught. It takes a lot of time, which there are people that, they're not patient. They want to see immediately results. But just needlessly long sentencing practices only requires the state to have to pay for more prison beds. It makes our communities less safe, and it tears apart our families.
Yeah, only thing I would add, because I thought those were both perfect responses by Mike and Marilyn, is there are reviewing the law itself and doing this classification and reining in some of the long sentences will be an exercise of really getting to know your criminal justice system, and it allows you to sort of see, and perhaps those dialogues will start to include what needs to happen is real data and real research, and right now, one of the reasons why I prosecuted cases for over a decade. I was a prosecutor, and then I was the U.S. attorney. The last case I did was to put the kidnapper of Elizabeth Smart in prison. And he's there for the rest of his life. And like Marilyn said, that's an appropriate place for him. He will, if he were out, he would harm another child. He would try to kidnap other children, and that's just a certainty. But those are very rare that in the criminal justice system. The bulk of what we prosecute are individuals that are on drugs and making bad decisions, and they resort to crime in order to fuel their drug addiction. And so if we can start to look at the criminal justice system in a way that's more than just the incarceration, like Mike pointed out, will actually lower the crime rate. So when I hear somebody say that, they accuse me of being soft on crime, I actually believe the individual that wants to ramp up all of the lengths of sentences are the ones who are soft on crime. They get to be tough on a criminal, but they're the ones that are soft on crime. And so if we can change that through showing people what works, and sometimes we have to show them what worked in Texas and what doesn't work in Texas, or we have to show them what works in Louisiana and not working. But if we start to communicate, which is what Right on Crime wants to do, is to combine all of the best practices and bring everybody up in higher levels of their criminal justice system on how it delivers to its citizens. And it should be beholden to the citizens and be accountable for what we've asked them to do.
Thank you for that, everyone. Two last questions. Second to last. What can everyday Oklahomans do practically to help bring about the change that's needed? This is to anyone who would like to respond.
I would say really look into and educate yourself on the criminal justice system. There's a lot of sensationalized, I can't pronounce that word, sorry, stories in the media that want to talk, they always want to talk about the worst of the worst crimes and make you scared and make you think that, this is what every criminal is like. And, really kind of like look past that and look at what other states are doing, look what's working, use a little common sense too. But also, reach out to your lawmakers and talk to them about it, especially if you have a personal experience. And when I say personal experience, whether you've been incarcerated, whether you have a family member incarcerated, or even if you've been a victim of a crime, I think it's important for them to hear those stories from the people in their districts and not just stick to what the media wants to put out there. And what certain advocacy groups, I see it all the time at the Capitol. They want to take that most extreme story that's going to, elicit that emotion in people and make them think, oh my gosh, if I vote against this, this is what's going to happen. And really just, listen to what's really happening. And that's kind of a good start for making change in Oklahoma.
Thanks, Marilyn. Anyone else?
Yeah, to back that up, basically, almost every person that is running the criminal legal system is an elected official, from lawmakers down to prosecutors and judges. So I talked earlier about the political pressures on judges and prosecutors, but those pressures can also go the other way. If you reach out to your DA, reach out to your local judge and tell them, hey, I don't think that these sentencing practices are in line with what's best for Oklahoma. Maybe that can reverse some of what we're doing. And the same is true, as Marilyn was talking about, for the lawmakers, just to let them know that this isn't what we have envisioned for Oklahoma.
Thanks, Mike. And, one thing I've heard as well from lawmakers is that, people think, oh, making a phone call that's not really doing much. But what I'm hearing from lawmakers is if I get 4 or 5 phone calls about something, I know it's pretty important. So we can't, minimize the effect of reaching out to our, elected officials. And then the last question is, any final words to leave with our viewers? Does anyone have any final words?
I think I'll just say I think it's remarkable to even have this conversation and to have people that want to listen. And I've spent 25 years in the criminal justice system, and as a family, we were also affected by violent crime when I was growing up, and we're now incarcerating the highest number of individuals in the world, and we're the only country, a first world country, that's approaching it this way, and yet our crime rates are still soaring. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and believing that we're going to have a different result. And so I hope that I can change that very thing, that this country starts to look at it differently, and that we start to approach the criminal justice system differently. That means we have to study what's working in other countries, what's working in other states, and we have to start applying that. And so if I can help do that for the rest of my career, I know I will leave a legacy that will affect my children and my grandchildren. And so that's why I do it. And I hope more people will do it.
It's a good word.
Yeah, and I always hate following Brett, but I will follow Brett. But I'll just add on there too that I always tell people at Right on Crime, they like to say that groups like ours do not care about victims. It's completely opposite. And if you look at the people who are involved with our organization, a majority of us, like Brett said, have been victims of violent crimes. And so that really makes us want to make sure that we get it right and that we handle people correctly, and that we're not just creating better criminals so that they can go and victimize someone else. So that's very important to us. I also like to tell people, 15 years ago, before I started working in this, I was 100% one of those people that was lock everybody up for the rest of their life so we don't ever have to deal with them before. And it took me really getting in there and hearing the stories of the people who are being affected by the criminal justice system to change my mindset, to realize that with a lot of these people who are in our system, we have failed them as a state. We have either failed them because they come from families where they were being abused and no one stepped in or did anything. We have failed them because maybe they fell into poverty and saw no other way out and they turned to crime. Or we've maybe failed them because they had some very severe mental health issues that no one bothered to step in and say, hey, here's some resource, let's get you some help. And that really changed my mindset of how I looked at how people get to corrections. I just always assumed if you're in corrections, it's because you're a really horrible person, and that's not the case. And changing everyone else's mindset is going to be a very, very long process, but I think it's something we can do.
Thank you, Marilyn. Mike, any last words?
Yeah, we focused a lot on the classification part of this, but the modernization is also important, and I think the viewer would probably have more fun with this part because there's a lot of crimes that just really don't have a place in modern Oklahoma. I think there's a crime that makes blasphemy on the Sabbath illegal. There's a crime that makes holding a horse tripping event illegal. So these kind of things are still in our code, And whether they're enforced or not, probably not, but just that they exist in our code shows that we need to modernize it.
Yeah, good point. Well, thank you, everyone. This concludes our panel. Thanks you all for sharing, and we are really happy that you are on, this side with us, working to make Oklahoma better with us, and we really appreciate your time. And thank you all for viewing, that are watching. And so if anyone wants to find out more about this topic, you can go to rightoncrime.com. And go through their website. There's a lot of resources there, as well as on our website at okjusticereform.org. And so we invite you to go look up, some information, educate yourself, and become better informed. All right, that's it. And thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.